Welcome to the second of the Sunday lectures on the theme Religion at King's Chapel. Last month the subject was the Anglican religion of King's Chapel, and today the subject is the Unitarian religion of King's Chapel. Now you may know this, but in the 19th century, Mrs. Oliver Wendell Holmes had something amusing to say about this Unitarian business. The Holmes were proprietors of the pews of King's Chapel, sat in pew number 102 up in the gallery toward the rear, and the Siena monument at the last on the north side is to Oliver Wendell Holmes. A friend on Beacon Hill had commented to Mrs. Holmes, "I didn't know you were Unitarian at King's Chapel." And Mrs. Holmes replied, "My dear, everyone in Boston is something, and Unitarian is the least you can be." Well, I think we all know by now Unitarian is not the least you can be. And if Unitarian moral and intellectual convictions weren't demanding enough, we've chosen also to be Christian Unitarians. In Boston during the 19th century, the Unitarian churches in the city numbered 38 and another 27 in towns that were shortly thereafter annexed to Boston, like Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Brighton, and Charlestown, a total of 65 Unitarian churches. And 9 of the Boston's original 10 Puritan churches became Unitarian. It was called at one time the Boston religion. Today, there are 4, maybe 5. And King's Chapel was where it all began. We will now be introduced to our distinguished speaker on this theme by Dr. Alan Spate. Alan has served this church in many capacities, including the vestry and the search committee that called the Reverend Joy Fallon. In his other life, he is professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Boston University, where he is a scholar of Hegel and German idealism, and he's the former administrator of the highly successful Institute for Philosophy and Religion. Alan Spate.
Thank you, Denton. It's a pleasure to welcome Dan McKanan to King's Chapel this afternoon. Dan is the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association's Senior Lecturer in Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. Boy, that's a mouthful, Dan. A Harvard undergraduate, he received his MDiv from Vanderbilt Divinity School and his PhD from the University of Chicago. After teaching for several years at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in Minnesota, he joined the Div School faculty in 2008. Dan's research has focused particularly on religious movements for social transformation in the United States from the abolitionist era to the present. His books include Prophetic Encounters, Religion in the American Radical Tradition from Beacon Press, which won the Frederick G. Melcher Book Award, Identifying the Image of God, Radical Christians and Nonviolent Power in the Antebellum United States from Oxford University Press, and The Catholic Worker After Dorothy, and Touching the World, Christian Communities Transforming Society, both from Liturgical Press. He is also the author of Our Roots in the Unitarian Universalist Pocket Guide, which you can get from Skinner Press. His articles and reviews span a wide range of fascinating topics and figures that I can just mention at the moment, from Wendell Phillips to Brook Farm to American Fourierism to the Occupy movement. He's currently working on a volume of original source items on the Unitarian movement at the present. He has preached at King's Chapel before in this great philosophical pulpit, which has hosted, as you know, such figures as Bishop Barclay and Alfred North Whitehead. But it's especially nice to have him here as the second part of this series to speak on the Unitarian religion of King's Chapel. Please welcome Dan McKanan.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you, Denton, for your leadership in pulling this series together and bringing me into what I hope will be a really enjoyable conversation this afternoon. And thanks to all of you for prioritizing this over this beautiful day, which we will all enjoy soon enough. Good leadership is often a little bit off-center. Alexander the Great spread Greek culture to much of the ancient world, but he came not from sophisticated Athens, but from the Macedonian backwater. The empire Alexander built was inherited first by the Romans, then by the Christians, then by the Muslims, each group perceived as uncouth barbarians by those who came before. The Mongols of Genghis Khan played a similar role in relation to the Chinese Empire. And history is filled with stories of outsiders who bring new energy and creativity to establish traditions and institutions. In reflecting on the Unitarian heritage of King's Chapel, I'll highlight two cases of off-center leadership. The first is that of Unitarianism in relation to American culture as a whole. The second of King's Chapel in relation to Unitarianism. Both cases involve a small community that doesn't quite fit within a large whole, but which exercises important leadership, not in spite of, but I think because of that lack of perfect fit. American Unitarianism, to begin, influenced American culture by being both central and marginal. It began here in Boston, a city that is one of the symbolic birthplaces of this country, even though it's in an out-of-the-way corner. Our denominational founders included some of the most powerful people in the country. Two of our first 6 presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, were Unitarian in their congregational affiliations, and the third, Thomas Jefferson, was a strong sympathizer. Yet Unitarianism was simultaneously a dangerous heresy, regarded by most Americans as outside the fold of true Christianity. The first campaign for a Christian party in politics, the great granddaddy of today's Christian right, was launched by activists who hoped they could defeat John Quincy Adams by portraying him as a non-Christian. American Unitarianism was born alongside the United States itself, and its culture helped shape the common culture of our nation. Unitarianism combined the rationalism of the Enlightenment with the earnestness of the Protestant Reformation, and these two qualities continue to characterize Americans in general. Most of the influential writers of the 19th century were either Unitarians or deeply influenced by their Unitarian friends. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Louisa May Alcott. Most 19th century social reform movements were inspired in part by the Unitarian emphasis on the capacity of every human being to grow in likeness to the divine. Unitarianism also changed American Christianity, transforming the mainstream traditions that professed to abhor it. At the beginning of the 19th century, most American Christians were revivalist and Calvinist in theology. They believed that human nature was totally depraved, that divine truth was to be found only in the words of the Bible interpreted literally, that God chose a minority of humankind to be saved despite ourselves, and that this salvation was achieved by passively accepting divine grace through an intensely emotional conversion. A century later, American Protestantism had become mainline. The major denominations had accepted a set of ideas that had once been associated exclusively with Unitarianism. These ideas included the notion that God wills the salvation of all people who are free to accept or reject divine grace. They include a historical approach to Scripture, treating it as a human testimony to divine revelation, written by ordinary humans and thus subject to the same interpretive practices you would use for any other text. Unitarian ideas that became mainline included the moral influence theory of the atonement, which holds that Jesus died not to appease the wrath of God, but to soften the hearts of humanity. Finally, these ideas included a social understanding of sin and salvation. Sin can be found not only in individual hearts, but in the social structures of racism, sexism, and inequality. And salvation thus involves building a just society in the here and now. Ironically, one of the hotbeds of all of these mainline ideas by the end of the 19th century was Andover Seminary, which was founded at the beginning of the century to oppose the newborn Unitarian movement. Still more ironically, 19th century Unitarians led the way to a new understanding of the first two persons of the Trinity. Prior to the Unitarian Reformation, when American Protestant theologians talked about the Father and the Son, it was often simply to defend the abstract propositions of Orthodox Trinitarianism. They had little to say about how the characteristics of a good Father and a good Son might help us better understand who God is. Indeed, when those theologians explained how Christ saved humanity, they often stressed that Jesus died to offend the offended honor of his perfect and vengeful Father. How many of you know fathers and sons who actually interact in that manner? Maybe some of us do know, but hopefully fathers and sons aspire to a different way of being together. First-generation Unitarians responded to that theology by stressing what William Ellery Channing called the parental character of God. We ascribe to God, he said, not only the name but the dispositions and principles of a father. We believe that God has a father's concern for his creatures, a father's desire for their improvement, a father's equity in proportioning his commands to their powers, a father's joy in their progress, a father's readiness to receive the penitent, and a father's justice for the incorrigible. For the remainder of the 19th century, Unitarians, most notably a child of this congregation named James Freeman Clark, continued to talk about the fatherhood of God as the idea first and foremost that distinguished them from Orthodox Christians. This might seem nonsensical to us today. Don't all Christians talk about God as Father? But one of our doctoral students at Harvard, Ryan Tobler, has been doing exhaustive research on this, and it really does appear that most Americans didn't really think about God as a father until after the Unitarians had started doing so. What's more, the Unitarians portrayed God not just as any father, but as a tender, kind-hearted father, not a strict disciplinarian, setting in motion a transformation of ideals of parental practice that is still unfolding in our generation today. Just as Unitarians replaced the abstract first person of the Trinity with an emotionally supportive father, so too they restored Jesus to American theology. 17th and 18th century Protestants had preached so much about Christ's role in the scheme of salvation that they sometimes forgot to tell the gospel stories of a human Jesus who loved his friends and reached out in compassion to the poor and the sick. We're inclined today to think of a personal relationship with Jesus as something that only the evangelicals have. But in many ways, it was Unitarians who made this possible because they were unencumbered by abstract doctrines about Christ. I could say more about that, but my primary task today is to situate King's Chapel within the Unitarian story. To do this, I will focus especially on the ministers who served this congregation during the 19th century, along with some of their relatives who brought the King's Chapel heritage into other Unitarian places. During the 19th century, King's Chapel was off-center in two ways. First of all, it was a historically Anglican congregation within a movement that was composed primarily of the descendants of the Puritans, both in Britain and in the United States. Second, and increasingly, it was distinct in its fidelity to a specifically Christian identity within a denomination that gradually expanded its scope to include transcendentalists, scientific theists, atheistic humanists, and eventually practitioners of non-Christian spiritualities. Neither sort of off-centeredness prevented King's Chapel from exercising national leadership. One way to express that leadership is through a little exercise of genealogy, focusing on the ministers and their families, some of the people whose busts are looking out at us from behind me. Please pay attention here, as I will be returning to this cast of characters throughout my talk. King's Chapel's first Unitarian minister, of course, was James Freeman, who served as rector from 1787 to 1836. He arrived as a recent Harvard graduate from a Puritan rather than an Anglican family, called to serve a congregation whose membership had collapsed during the American Revolution. It was Freeman who persuaded the congregation to abandon the ultra-Trinitarian Athanasian Creed and later to revise its entire liturgy. When it became clear that Freeman's beliefs made him ineligible for Anglican ordination, the wardens of the congregation ordained him themselves. From the beginning, Freeman promoted Unitarianism beyond the boundaries of his parish. He helped to organize the first Unitarian church in Portland, Maine, and the first in Baltimore. It was in that church that William Ellery Channing preached the sermon that is generally regarded as the founding manifesto of American Unitarianism. Freeman was there first. Freeman also served on the committee that created the American Unitarian Association, the first denominational organization. During the years he was helping to build a national denomination, Freeman and his wife, Martha Clark Freeman, were raising Martha's grandson, James Freeman Clark. Over the next half-century, Clark emerged as one of the most important of denominational leaders. Like his grandfather, he was eager to plant Unitarianism beyond the neighborhood of Boston, and so his first ministry was in the brand new congregation in Louisville, Kentucky. When Clark returned to Boston a decade later, he did not take up ministry at one of the established parishes, but created a new model of congregation, the Church of the Disciples, that drew together ecumenically minded social activists, including Julia Ward Howe and other promoters of women's ordination. Clark was a close friend of transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, and like them, an admirer of the German idealist philosophy that Alan is expert in. But he had a different view of the implications of that philosophy for Christian belief. For him, transcendentalism was not an alternative to Christianity, but a way of understanding its deepest truths. For that reason, he became a leader in what was known as the broad church impulse within 19th century Unitarianism, committed to holding transcendentalists and traditional Christians together in a single church body where they would be able to learn from one another. Clark was also the first person to teach courses on world religions at Harvard Divinity School, but he consistently did so from a Christian perspective, exploring other faiths in relation to what he saw as the ultimate truths taught by Jesus of Nazareth. Meanwhile, back here at King's Chapel, James Freeman was succeeded by his assistant, Francis Greenwood. I can't see him from where I am. Greenwood had grown up at King's Chapel and was a bit precocious. He started Harvard at age 13 and was ordained at age 21. Prior to coming to King's Chapel, he spent some time serving that congregation in Baltimore, so he had an early commitment to Unitarianism as a national movement. The next minister here was Ephraim Peabody, who served from 1845 to 1856. Peabody was an old friend of James Freeman Clark. He'd served as minister in Cincinnati when Clark was across the river in Louisville. Prior to that, Peabody had been a tutor to Clark's wife Anna, who was the daughter of Harm Jan Huidekoper, the patriarch of Pennsylvania Unitarianism and founder of Meadville Seminary. Pennsylvania Unitarianism initially had a very different flavor from the Boston tradition, so Clark's and Peabody's connections to this family helped seal the national character of the denomination. That legacy continued on into the next generations, for Peabody was the father-in-law of one denominational president and the grandfather of another. Peabody's son, Francis Greenwood Peabody, served for decades as professor at Harvard and minister of Harvard's Memorial Church. Those of you who've worshipped at Memorial Church know that even today, it has some liturgical commonalities with King's Chapel. Francis Greenwood Peabody is remembered as one of the pioneers of the social gospel movement. He began the teaching of sociology to future ministers. Indeed, his students referred to one of his classes as Peebo's Drainage, Drunkenness, and Divorce, because of the disciplined way their professor introduced them to the details of social problems. Francis Greenwood Peabody's sister Anna married Henry Whitney Bellows, the most important broad church leader and organizer of the National Conference of Unitarian Churches, which was the first denominational body to be composed of congregations rather than simply of individuals. Interestingly, one of Bellow's greatest adversaries in that work was Francis Ellenwood Abbott, a scientific theist who hoped that the new organization would liberate itself entirely from the Christian past. Yet Abbott was also a Peabody relative, a first cousin to Ephraim Peabody. It's a long-standing joke about Unitarianism as a conspiracy of cousins. To round things out, a third child of Ephraim Peabody, Ellen Darby Peabody, married into the most prominent lay family in King's Chapel, the Elliots. Her father-in-law, Samuel Atkins Elliott, was a warden of this church as well as mayor of Boston. Her husband, Charles Elliott, served as president of Harvard from 1869 to 1909. Religious conservatives like to remember Elliott as the man who secularized Harvard by creating an elective-based curriculum and abolishing mandatory attendance at chapel, but he was really a deeply committed liberal Christian. Charles and Ellen's son, Samuel Atkins Elliott II, served as president of the American Unitarian Association during the first decades of the 20th century, when it absorbed Bellow's National Conference to form a united, more centralized denominational structure. By general agreement, Samuel Atkins Elliott and Henry Whitney Bellows were two of the three most important denominational leaders prior to the merger of Unitarians and Universalists. They were the visionaries that made Unitarianism a genuinely national church, and they both had an intimate tie to King's Chapel. I'll mention in passing that the third important pre-consolidation denominational leader, Frederick May Elliott, was not only also an Elliott, though from a different branch of that family, but he was a great-great-nephew of Colonel Joseph May, one of the wardens who voted with James Freeman to support King's Chapel's conversion to Unitarianism. By my calculation, that means that Frederick May Elliott was also a second cousin once removed to Louisa May Alcott, as well as first cousin to the poet T.S. Eliot. Cousins after cousins. The King's Chapel Elliots also had a familial tie to the congregation's next minister, Henry Wilder Foote, who served from 1861 to 1889. Foote married Charles Elliott's sister Frances, and their son Henry Wilder Foote was the editor of Hymns of the Spirit, a hymnal jointly commissioned by the Unitarians and the Universalists 3 decades before consolidation. The King's Chapel connection to UU hymnody continued even after that, for a grandson of the Foote family, Arthur Foote II, was co-editor of Hymns for the Celebration of Life, produced around the time of consolidation. The last minister whose writings I examined in preparing for this talk was Howard Nicholson Brown, who served from 1895 to 1921. I wasn't able to find any biographical information about him. I didn't look that hard. So I hope that some of you will be able to instruct me on ways he was or wasn't connected to the Unitarian movement nationally. Okay, so I hope I made the case for national leadership. This was made possible, I suggest, by the congregation's fidelity to its Anglican and Christian particularity. I should stress in making that point that it's not my intent to offer a personal endorsement of either Anglican or Christian particularity, or to suggest that Unitarian Universalism as a whole would be better if it looked just like King's Chapel. Personally, I identify as a liberal Christian of a decidedly non-Anglican sort, but I also identify as a Unitarian Universalist who is 100% committed to the radical religious pluralism of our tradition as it exists today. I cherish King's Chapel's particularity as part of that rich mix. If I were speaking to the Unitarian Universalist Buddhist Fellowship, I might say some of the same things I'm saying to you. I hope that at least some of you share my enthusiasm for King's Chapel's role as a vital part of Unitarian Universalism, though I certainly understand that this need not be at the expense of a vital relationship to Christianity as a whole, to the city of Boston, or to any other context in which you live. So how did King's Chapel's Anglican heritage help it exercise off-center leadership within Unitarianism? In both England and the United States, Unitarianism emerged primarily from the Congregationalist wing of Puritanism. This was natural in many ways. Puritans sought to purify Christianity of unscriptural elements, and the Trinity is an unscriptural element. Congregationalists were wary of universally binding creeds, vesting authority in local congregations. Many congregations were bound together by covenants that were light on doctrine. That left a lot of room for theological change and innovation. The Puritans of Massachusetts also prized an educated ministry, and they'd founded Harvard for that purpose. By the early 19th century, Harvard was a hotbed of Enlightenment liberalism, the philosophical tradition that informed early Unitarianism. But the factors that made Congregationalists open to Unitarianism also worked to delay an open break between the liberals and the Orthodox. Very few early Unitarians believed their disagreement with the Trinitarians was worth dividing the churches. They regarded it as a matter of abstract speculation irrelevant to true Christianity. When a Harvard-educated minister found he could no longer preach Trinitarian doctrine in good conscience, he didn't start preaching Unitarian doctrine. He just stopped talking about it. By the end of the 18th century, that's what most ministers in the Boston area had done. Given the flexibility of the Puritan liturgy, they could do that without anybody really noticing. In the Anglican context, people noticed when you stopped being Trinitarian. Trinitarian references appeared throughout the Book of Common Prayer. Anglican priests were required to subscribe to the doctrinal 39 articles. When Anglican priests discovered they couldn't do so, they faced a much sharper crisis of conscience than their Puritan counterparts. That's what happened to a British priest named Theophilus Lindsay around 1770. His first recourse was to submit a petition to Parliament, but it was rejected. Lindsay then organized the Essex Street Chapel as the first avowedly Unitarian congregation in England. King's Chapel's conversion to Unitarianism echoed the founding of Essex Street, and Lindsay's revision of the Anglican prayer book was a model for the new prayer book developed here. But there was an additional factor involved here, and that, of course, is the collapse of the Anglican Church in North America after the Revolution. When King's Chapel called James Freeman as reader, most of its proprietary families had left Boston because of their loyalist sympathies. The same thing was happening in Anglican congregations from Massachusetts to Georgia. The bishops, an indispensable component in Anglican polity, abandoned the new nation. So King's Chapel's turn to Unitarianism was part of a larger project intended to reconstitute Anglicanism on a basis suitable to American democracy. The new liturgy didn't just remove references to the Trinity. For example, it also dropped prayers for the king. What's more, James Freeman imagined the changes he implemented at King's Chapel would be imitated by other parishes, allowing for the birth of a new national church that would be both liberal and thoroughly American. The Church of England had expired among the flames of the Revolution, he wrote, but we hoped that a new and more beautiful church would rise from the ashes. Now that wasn't to be. More doctrinally orthodox American Anglicans had sent one of their number, Samuel Seabury, to England, later Scotland, for episcopal ordination. And ultimately it was Seabury and not Freeman who reorganized the American church. But for an example of what King's Chapel had hoped to achieve in its early years, I'd call your attention to the Church of South India. This is one of the great success stories of the 20th century ecumenical movement, a united national church that holds together congregations that had been Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and Methodist, and that achieved independence, achieved its ecclesial status at the same time as India was achieving independence from Britain, and thus has been able to grow up with the specifically national identity of India. I'm no expert on this story, but if this aspect of King's Chapel's history intrigues you, you might find it interesting to study the Church of South India as a kind of what might have been. Denied the chance to lead a transformed Anglican communion, King's Chapel instead catalyzed the transformation of Boston Congregationalism. Over the course of Freeman's ministry, and because of that ministry, Boston liberals became more and more open about their Unitarian sympathies, provoking what is known as the Unitarian Controversy, a 20-year period in which congregations divided, ministers stopped exchanging pulpits with one another, and Harvard Divinity School and Andover Seminary were created as rival ministerial schools, one for the liberals and one for the Orthodox. At the end of the controversy, the new denomination took its initial form as the American Unitarian Association. Even then, many Unitarians remained ambivalent about building a national movement. Unlike today's Unitarian Universalist Association, the AUA was simply a voluntary society of individuals. Congregations could take it or leave it. In part, the choice of many congregations to not invest in the building of a national movement was because their leaders still doubted that the fight with the Orthodox should be church dividing. But it also reflected the reality that Congregationalist churches, unlike the Anglicans, had not experienced a crisis during the Revolution. They remained a comfortable part of the standing order of Massachusetts, receiving funding through local taxation. The constitutional prohibition of established religion applied initially only to the federal government, so there was tax support for Unitarian churches in Massachusetts right through the 1830s. Given these complacency-inducing circumstances, and King's Chapel's very different background, it's not surprising that people associated with King's Chapel would be the visionaries imagining what it would be like for Unitarianism to thrive beyond Massachusetts. Eventually, of course, King's Chapel attained a different sort of off-centeredness within Unitarianism. While the national denomination made room for transcendentalists, scientific theists, atheistic humanists, and others, King's Chapel championed the enlightened Christianity of the denomination's founders. I'll use the remainder of my time to reflect on some components of King's Chapel's Christianity, drawing on sermons and other writers produced by that list of ministers I introduced earlier. I should stress that I am no expert on these ministers. I dipped into a few sermons by each one in preparing this talk, but left the vast majority of their writings untouched. So take everything I have to say from here on as a hypothesis to be tested through further research. In the sermons I read, I sensed a remarkable coherence of religious vision stretching over a century and a half. I almost felt that any one of these ministers could have written the sermons of the others. Above all, they shared three elements. First, their theology centered on the person of Jesus. Second, all believed that the encounter with Jesus had the power to change people, to instill in them devotional practices that would make them progressively more like Jesus. And third, all believed that the personal transformation made possible by Jesus was the key to transforming society and making it conform more closely to the kingdom preached by Jesus. I'll consider each of these points in turn. I said before that the founders of Unitarianism hoped that their challenge to Trinitarianism would draw people closer to Jesus by getting the doctrines out of the way. The ministers of King's Chapel kept that hope alive when other Unitarians abandoned it. To be a Christian, they were convinced, was to be in a vital relationship with Jesus. To have Christ is to have life, preached Francis Greenwood, explaining that we receive life when we take Jesus as teacher, example, and Savior. Decades later, Henry Wilder Foote added that the more the world changed, the more relevant Jesus became. This is a long quote. That Jesus Christ is specially and wonderfully the revealer and the revelation of the divine, I surely believe. It seems to me that the more the world advances in knowledge, dropping its plummet further and further into the sea of being and still finding that it is beyond soundings, the more sure a stay and hold amid the swaying tides of all beside is given by the abiding disclosure of God's goodness and providence and fatherhood, which Jesus gives, and which I find in him alone. Harvard President Charles Eliot made a similar point when he spoke to the Harvard Summer School on the future of religion in 1909. In many ways, that talk represented the typical attitudes of early 20th century Unitarians rather than the distinctive perspective of King's Chapel. Buoyantly optimistic, confident that his personal faith would soon be the faith of everybody, Eliot sketched out a future religion that would be democratic, scientific, and oriented to this world. He scarcely mentioned Jesus until the last paragraph. But then he gave Jesus the final word, declaring, quote, "This 20th century religion is not only to be in harmony with the great secular movements of modern society, democracy, individualism, social idealism, but also in essential agreement with the direct personal teachings of Jesus, as they are reported in the Gospels. The revelation he gave to mankind thus becomes more wonderful than ever." When the ministers of King's Chapel thought about Jesus, they didn't see him as an all-powerful Lord or a man's man, but as an example of gentle, feminine compassion. James Freeman, for example, preached a sermon on the tenderness of Jesus, in which he took as his text the gospel story in which Jesus, hanging from the cross, asks the beloved disciple to care for his mother after he's gone. In order to conceive of the sublimity of this tenderness, Freeman preached, it is necessary to advert to the situation of Jesus. He was fixed to a cross, suspended not by cords, but his whole weight was supported by the wounds which the nails had made in his hands and feet. Jesus was not only in physical agony, Freeman went on, but was feeling abandoned by his heavenly Father. And yet his first priority was to care for other people. Amidst this terror and this agony, his tenderness was as much alive as ever. And when he saw at the foot of the cross his mother, compassion for her grief and anxiety for her future welfare almost erased the idea of his own suffering. A century later, Howard Nicholson Brown preached a remarkably similar sermon on the divine gentleness, in which he explained that it is only the gentleness of the Lord that can make men great. Religions that stress the power of God or the power of nature breed contempt of humankind, Brown warned. But when we come to conceive of the supreme authority of the universe as one of love and kindness and goodwill, as a strong hand put forth not to frighten or overawe, but to seek and save the lost, under such a rule as that, we can lift up our heads. The ministers of King's Chapel were convinced that the Unitarian critique of Trinitarianism was a help, not a hindrance, to a Jesus-centered piety. Trinitarian doctrines were too abstract. They stood in between the ordinary Christian and Jesus. Howard Nicholson Brown put it best in a historic sermon on Unitarianism. Affirming the traditional Christian understanding of Jesus as mediator, Brown argued that this was inconsistent with the Orthodox affirmation that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. Quote, "As mediator, he ought not to be too closely identified with either the divine or the human realm. Wherever he came from and whoever he was, he could only perform what Christendom has held to be his great work by coming into some middle place." Speaking at a time when many Unitarians were no longer Christian, Brown was willing to forego traditional claims about Jesus' uniqueness, but not his personal experience of Jesus' friendship. That he is man's only mediator, I do not dare to say, but that for people born and reared as we have been, he is the greatest friend to those who would walk and live in the Spirit, the most certain guide for those who wish to approach the infinite presence. Brown's reference to those who would walk and live in the Spirit brings me to the second commonality I find in the King's Chapel ministers. All of them preached Jesus because they believed that an intimate connection to Jesus was the key to personal moral development. Because they believed that Jesus was fully and only human, they believed that other humans could and should imitate him. Again and again they said, here I'm quoting Freeman, that the character of Jesus is proposed as a model for imitation. Francis Greenwood made the same point more extravagantly. Is it not then to have the Son in a strict and exalted sense, when we have his temper, his piety, his inclinations, resolutions, and principles, when we have all his attainable characteristics? When James Freeman called attention to Jesus' tenderness from the cross, his point was not that only a divine being could possibly be so compassionate, but rather that everyone should strive to be so. It's sometimes assumed that 19th century Americans, especially wealthy 19th century American men, became Unitarian because the Unitarian Church placed fewer demands on them personally than did its Orthodox competitors. As we already heard, this is surely what Mrs. Oliver Wendell Holmes thought the point of Unitarianism was. Certainly, the Unitarians differed from the Orthodox in that they did not demand that new church members testify to a specific experience of conversion. But these ministers at King's Chapel consistently demanded much more. In a tract intended for prospective church members, for example, Ephraim Peabody did not, like evangelical tract writers today, merely hold out the promise of salvation to anyone who accepts Jesus as Savior. He offered these would-be Christians an entire curriculum, suggesting that they identify their most pressing religious questions and read through the Gospels several times, notebook in hand, writing down everything that spoke to the questions they had identified. Once they'd done that, he pointed out, this is subordinate to something of still higher importance. We study the Gospels not only to know, but to live. Accordingly, Peabody urged his readers continually to ask, what would God here and now approve of my doing? Henry Wilder Foote echoed this sentiment several decades later. He expressed a typically Unitarian optimism about human nature, but this optimism was not grounds for complacency, but a goad to continual improvement. The possibilities of evil and weakness which are in every soul may become realities of good and strength. Exactly for that end is life given us, and all its encouragements and all its hardnesses invite us toward that grand result. This commitment to personal discipleship was, in turn, the key to King's Chapel's approach to social change. These ministers were far from social radicals, but they shared a very deep theory of social change, according to which the individual transformation brought about by imitation of Jesus would ultimately change the whole ecology of society. In the first sermon in Francis Greenwood's collected sermons, for example, he preached on the story in which God speaks to Elijah not in a wind or earthquake or fire, but in a still small voice. This was, he said, an illustration of how God works both in the physical and the moral world. Echoing 18th century liberals' criticisms of revivalism, he said that sudden or violent convulsions do not constitute the chief power of his government or his manner of conducting the affairs of the universe. Instead, Greenwood suggested, it is in these chains of causes, this patient preparation, that we are to discover the real energy of a process. Even the wind and earthquake and fire take a long time to build themselves up. And so, great moral or intellectual changes are the work of time, and revolutions are the birth of many years. Did you notice that we heard this same sermon from this pulpit this morning? Very deep tradition here of attending to long, gradual, patient processes. And so Greenwood offered a patient prescription for social reform. The rubbish of lumbering prejudices must be cleared away from the soil which we would occupy and improve. The long-rooted weeds of error must be eradicated. The same hard ground must be traversed and turned and tilled over and over. And light must be admitted into the ancient and tangled forest ray by ray. Noting that the Lord attains his end by mild and gentle means rather than severe ones, Greenwood warned his hearers not to approach their own social change agendas in the most boisterous and severest manner, lest through excessive zeal for change, the heavens be set ablaze and the wide face of the earth blackened with ruins. Ephraim Peabody made Greenwood's ideas concrete in his personal involvement with the social evils of poverty and slavery. He was the minister who brought King's Chapel more fully into the work of the Benevolent Fraternity, established to bring the Unitarian message to Boston's working classes which lives on in today's Unitarian Universalist urban ministry. Peabody also wrote a complex and influential book on slavery. Like most Unitarian ministers of the time, Peabody was troubled by slavery but unsympathetic to abolition. He counseled a slow, moderate path that would not violate the constitutional principle of states' rights. But some of the arguments he made for that position revealed a deep insight. Slavery could not be abolished abruptly, Peabody argued, because it was not a mere excrescence on the surface of society, but an essential and controlling element in the whole social organization of the Southern people. I think he might well have added that racism was an essential and controlling element in the whole social organization of the Northern people. Given the cultural embeddedness of slavery, Peabody argued, the whites need to go through a training for freedom, scarcely less than the blacks. The master is as much fettered to one end of the chain as the slave to the other, and it would be difficult to say which is least prepared for emancipation. Perhaps anticipating our own ongoing struggle to overcome the legacy of slavery, he added that, quote, to expunge slavery from the statute book would be far easier than to legislate into the minds of whites or blacks the ideas which belong to free institutions. It was on this basis that he called for an end to slavery not through revolution, but through growth. The social vision of Greenwood and Peabody fittingly found its fruition in the son of the second and namesake of the first, Francis Greenwood Peabody. As I mentioned before, he was one of the founders of the social gospel movement, one of the people who argued that Christianity involved an approach to society as well as to the individual. But he was very much at the conservative end of the social gospel spectrum. His most important book, Jesus Christ and the Social Question, was a rebuttal to socialists and anarchists who claimed that Jesus of Nazareth was a working-class radical with a concrete plan for social change. The real Jesus was nothing of this sort, replied Peabody. He stood aloof from specific social issues and addressed himself to the hearts of individuals. But in so doing, Jesus provided his disciples with the tools they needed to respond appropriately to the ever-changing social challenges of their times. Now, I must admit that I am not in perfect sympathy with the social vision I found expressed by King's Chapel's 19th century ministers. Much of my own scholarship has focused on the people who were being implicitly criticized in the passages I just read. People like the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who argued that the only Christian response to slavery was to abolish it immediately, with no transitional tutelage for the slaves and no compensation for the owners. My scholarship is about people like the Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, who, contra Peabody, declared unequivocally that Jesus had been a socialist and a revolutionary. These men undoubtedly would regard the words of Greenwood and the Peabodys as pious platitudes intended to salve the consciences of the wealthy. But after reading Greenwood and Peabody for myself, that's a judgment I cannot quite share. They may not have been correct in their social sentiments, but I'm confident that they were sincere. And they had a legitimate point about the gradualness of social change. The abolitionists could talk all they liked about immediate abolition, but it actually ended through a gradual process that involved back and forth influences between African Americans and European Americans, Northerners and Southerners, radicals and conservatives. And even though it ended in one of those violent cataclysms that Francis Greenwood said are not God's usual way of acting, the past 150 years have provided abundant proof that the rubbish of lumbering prejudices must still be cleared away from the soil. And the same hard ground must still be traversed and turned and tilled over and over before we can say that the work of social change is done. Ultimately, my own sympathies perhaps lie with another child of King's Chapel, the abolitionist Samuel Joseph May. May's father, Colonel Joseph May, was a long-standing warden here. He was one of those who voted to support the changes to the liturgy brought about by James Freeman. Samuel Joseph grew up with the young Unitarian movement, and as a true child of King's Chapel, He was especially committed to spreading it beyond its Boston stronghold. Others might go to Kentucky or Ohio. He was brave enough to go to Connecticut, heartland of the Orthodox. He was also one of the first, I think maybe the first, Unitarian minister to cast his lot with Garrisonian abolition, which he saw as the logical implication of the Unitarian faith and the divine potential of every person. But while other Garrisonians had only contempt for conservative ministers, May remonstrated patiently with them, above all with his mentor, William Ellery Channing. It was May's patience, much more than Garrison's invective, that finally drew Channing into the abolitionist camp. In my own radicalism, I hope to be a bit more like Samuel Joseph May than like Garrison. And that's why I'm so glad to have been given this chance to speak to all of you at King's Chapel today. You have a rich and remarkably coherent tradition of Christian faith and practice. Your heritage has enriched all of the larger communities in which you participate, among them the Unitarian Universalist tradition that I cherish, and that I've been called to uphold through my work at Harvard Divinity School. I hope that my words today have made at least a small contribution to your ongoing reflection about what that tradition means for your future. Thank you.